The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has vowed to go after Scottish independence votes in the event of a hard Brexit. The First Minister said that she would defy the British Prime Minister if Tories break promises made to Scotland. What are the promises that have been made to Scotland? If those promises are a flexible Brexit, wouldn't that jeopardize the EU itself? In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss whether Nicola Sturgeon has issued a stern warning to the UK and how she intends to seek new powers to help keep Scotland in the single market, even if the UK leaves, that is, if the UK leaves the EU.
4 months after the Leave camp clinched the victory in the referendum on Britain's membership in the European Union, the new British government is facing formidable challenges before it fires the starting gun for the Brexit process. On Monday, British Prime Minister Theresa May held talks with the First Ministers of Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland on the government's Brexit plans. However, the session at 10 Downing Street failed to appease all participants.
Well, we had a frank exchange of views. I don't mind admitting large parts of the meeting were deeply frustrating. I don't know any more now about the UK government's approach to the EU negotiations than I did before I went into the meeting. At the moment, it doesn't appear to me that there is a UK negotiating strategy, which is one of the sources of great frustration.
Highlighting the fact that Scots voted against leaving the EU, Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said she was not prepared to watch Scotland driven off a hard Brexit cliff edge.
Well, I respect the fact that England and Wales voted to leave, but Scotland voted to stay in. So I'll try to find a way of squaring that circle. But what I'm not prepared to do as First Minister is simply stand back and watch Scotland driven off a hard Brexit cliff edge, because the consequences in lost jobs, lost investment, lower living standards are too serious for that, and I'm not prepared to watch that happen, at least not without giving Scotland the option of choosing a better alternative.
Sturgeon, who raised the prospect of holding a second Scottish independence vote right after the Brexit, warned she was not, quote, bluffing over the issue if Scotland's rejection of the Brexit was not respected. Sturgeon's Welsh counterpart, Carwyn Jones, also said the Brexit talks with the EU should not begin until there is an agreed approach to negotiations with the bloc. The two leaders also stressed their desire to see continued participation in the European single market, a situation that could be at risk given the battle of wills between London and Brussels. Senior EU officials have made it clear they will not accept the UK's membership in the European single market unless it continues to make a sizable contribution to the EU budget and also continues to allow the free movement of European workers into the country. Economists have time and again warned May about the consequences of Britain crashing out of the market. In August, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said the country could be permanently poorer by 4% of GDP. However, the British Prime Minister is upbeat about a smooth divorce from the bloc. Following the Downing Street session, she told the lawmakers in Westminster it was not accurate to suggest that Britain was headed for a hard Brexit because it did not face a binary choice between curbing immigration and getting a good trade deal with the EU. May, who replaced David Cameron following the shock vote to leave the EU in June, has promised to make the Brexit a success for the country. Despite her upbeat gesture, what's certain is that she's facing an uphill battle to deliver on her promise.
Well, guest joining us for this edition of the debate, political analyst and former American intelligence linguist Scott Rickard joins us from Tampa. And we have investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joins us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both. Tony Gosling, let me first start with you. Obviously, it would be proper for us to see how you would break down the statements made there by Nicola Sturgeon. She has insisted that a hard Brexit would amount to the UK government breaking the promises it made during the Scottish referendum. First of all, tell us what those promises were that were made to Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, actually, there were no really hard promises made because nobody knew quite what the outcome was going to be. I mean, I think when you go into a referendum, and I think it's also important to say, I think Theresa May is actually doing a really good job here in saying today, as she has, that there won't be a parliamentary vote on this. It's because the people have already voted. What they're doing is just ensuring, as a government down in Downing Street and Westminster, that this is that people's will is going to be actually implemented implemented. So she's doing a good job in that. And we've got quite a lot of people who have got close ties, financial ties, and all sorts to the European Union and to Brussels, who are basically just going through a period of sour grapes. Well, our little part of Britain didn't vote for Brexit, therefore we want to have some sort of separate agreement with Brussels. And I'm afraid the United Kingdom is one country, so if the country as a whole decides it's going to go for Brexit, it's going to go for Brexit. It's not exit, England exit, it's the whole of the United Kingdom which is leaving. Also worth noting, very important this, that it's not surprising to me that she's wanting to have another independence referendum from the United Kingdom up in Scotland very, very quickly. And that is because she wants to do that before Brexit itself happens, which will be in about 2 years' time. So, and the reason she wants to do that is because she knows that the Scottish, at least the YouGov recent poll, says that there are 10% more Scots that prefer the UK to the European Union. So this poll, which came out 30th of July this year, it was reported in the magazine under the headline, "The Scots Prefer Post-Brexit UK to Independence." If she leaves it until after Britain leaves the European Union in 2 years' time, finally, then the Scots, it looks as if at the current poll levels, are overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the United Kingdom and leaving the European Union. As many people, ordinary people right across the continent, 800 million people, are actually getting fed up with the total mismanagement of the economy and the borders by Brussels.
So Scott Rickard, our guest there, just went right to the heart of the matter, didn't he? Because the report card of the EU doesn't really speak too much. However, we're looking at a couple issues here. First, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, pretty much giving a warning to Theresa May. Of course, this has to deal with the light Brexit as opposed to a hard Brexit, and what Scotland seems to want is intent to stay in the EU. Do you think, first of all, that Nicola Sturgeon will go ahead with her independence aspirations as she has threatened to do?
Well, I would hope so, actually. When I look at the EU versus the UK, obviously, like the U.S., you have some, ships with many holes in them. You have sinking ships of financial fiat money type economies that deserve to be sinking. The way that they treat the other nations around the world and control the finances to their benefit is absolutely unfair to countries like Greece and other countries around the world, especially third world countries that have to operate, even at a longer arm underneath the Paris Club and the London Club and the likes of the other financiers that are basically stacking the deck in their favor. Now, when it comes to Scotland, I would have to say that, Scotland has a long history of fighting with England, and they have a long history of trying to be independent. And I would say, my hat's off to them. I hope they have an opportunity to do that again. And certainly England has fantastic allies. If you look at the allies they have in England when it comes to even Sweden for 500 years, and the ties even into Germany and into Italy are quite strong as well, given their historical relationships in the economic community. So if you look at the fact that England is really part of the global economy that's crashing on a daily basis, I mean, just recently, of all people, Goldman Sachs was bailing out Deutsche Bank again. And, you have the Deutsche Bank is the real center of production and finance in the European Union now. And certainly England's not benefiting from pulling out already. The pound is down quite a bit. And you have banks that are threatening to pull out in the EU. So I think what's happening here is the beginning of the end, hopefully, for the EU. The EU was not good for European states. It became a federated institution that was trying to control everything from militaries to police from a privatization perspective. And now you see it crumbling, and hopefully for the sovereignty and for the good of the people, not only in England and Scotland, I hope that it does actually crash. And I hope that we do see some real legitimacy around financing, not only in the West, but also across other countries around the world.
Well, Tony Gosling, maybe you can tell us what the UK has in mind in the form of talks with regards to Brexit, because based on what Nicola Sturgeon has said, in so many words, she felt that London had no strategy.
Well, she would say that, wouldn't she? I mean, she is one of these what we call remoaners, people who are just moaning and moaning because they didn't get the right result out of the Brexit referendum. Pitted against people like Nicola Sturgeon are what they call the Brexiteers, that is to say the people, sort of musketeers if you want, who have been, many of them sort of grassroots activists behind this, saying, look, democracy is not working within the European Union and we need to secede. Just as people, for example, in Texas have been talking about in the United States. When things go wrong at the top, when you've got corruption at the top, that's just a normal thing that happens. But I think as for Theresa May, she's playing her cards close to her chest. Look, there's lots and lots of important negotiations going to be taking for the next 2 years. And in the run-up to the opening of these negotiations, next Easter, roughly, is when they're going to be triggering Article 50, and the process of leaving the European Union is going to start. Now, there was not really anything like such a fuss when we joined the EU, as it was in the time of the Common Market, back in the early 1970s. And that's because the establishment has already decided that it can control and run affairs right across Europe using the EU. And there are a lot of powerful establishment figures, including media figures, finance figures in the City of London, who just assumed they would be able to use Brussels to control the continent. And there's a very good reason why Theresa May is playing her cards close to her chest. She's not saying much about what she intends to do. I would be doing exactly the same as her. If you're going into negotiations, you don't show your cards before you go in the room.
Well, Scott Rickard, you talked about the EU and its pretty much its existence. Now, just hours ago, this piece of news really resonated the unstable footing of the EU when you had the German foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He came out and said that he's set up to open a public debate on the future of the EU. And the headline read, EU in violent turmoil that might end up with the union's collapse. The German foreign minister saying this, that has sent the bloc into violent turmoil. And he put the problems, he pitted it on the financial crisis, the refugee influx, and the shock from the Brexit referendum. Are we really looking at a possibility of the EU breaking up?
Well, certainly you are. I mean, the fact remains is that, as I said in my previous comment, Goldman Sachs has absolutely no leverage in bailing out Deutsche Bank. And as Deutsche Bank is, it is actually one of the largest, most successful banking environments in the European Union. At the same time, Qatar has also threatened to pull money out of the EU and Deutsche Bank because of some of the financial underpinnings that are going on there as well. So is it in the early stages of failing? I would say yes, absolutely. The signs are there. All the major holders of the notes are absolutely in the United States are not in a position. They are way over leveraged on their debt to cash ratios. They are absolutely not in a position to be bailing out the Deutsche Bank or anyone else around the world. So you have literally a fiat system here that is falling apart at the seams. And for the Scottish referendum and the kind of threatening, just as Mr. Gosling is saying, absolutely they have to position themselves in a position of safety, because they will be affected not only by the EU failing, they'll also be affected by the lack of trading power that goes alongside the pound. The pound is falling at an alarming rate. They've had horrible reports on the industries of futures for orders. Their financial outcome does not look good, and they certainly aren't able to carry any of the other states within the United Kingdom. Ireland's been suffering for quite some time, and you certainly don't see them reaching out and helping out any of the other European countries. In fact, the UK really was only about half in. They never even converted their currency. So this is a country that has absolutely, started the process, but I wouldn't blame it on the European Union. It was a failed system before Brexit was actually started, and I don't blame the English people for being smart enough to see that.
A good point about the UK not changing its currency and it being halfway in. But here we have, Tony Gosling, what Theresa May has said, that she is going to stand in the way of a second referendum when it comes to Scotland. And Theresa May has obviously said, let there be no doubt that if you do that, then we are going to choose a better future. Is Theresa May going to actually stop Scotland from going ahead?
Well, yes, she is, and I would imagine the Scots will have at some point another chance. That they voted to stay in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, so maybe in 6-7 years' time there may be another one. But the idea that you can keep voting, Nicola Sturgeon, until you get the result you want is just not on. It's not going to happen. That's the way of the EU, for example, with the Irish vote on the Lisbon Treaty. The Irish were told you've got to keep voting until the European Union gets the right result. But there is, I mean, as Scots sort of alluded to there's a much bigger picture in going on here in the background, and that is really the battle between the people and the banks, the banksters. Who controls the money system? And we've had so much hideous austerity across the Eurozone and here in Britain, in the pound zone, you might call it, and of course in the United States since 2008, particularly since the bailout, which really where the banks should have been allowed to collapse, but they weren't. Massive amounts of public money was put in to keep them going, where ordinary businesses would have had to fail. So this is a very important other side to the problem. And for example, when we've been told by Alistair Campbell, who many consider as a war criminal for penning the dodgy dossier which led to the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. He was Tony Blair's spin doctor at the time. He has been saying just this week that the pound is going to plunge as soon as the Article 50 is signed next round about Easter time, when they sign that. And I would suggest that he's very close to these banksters and he knows exactly what their tactics are. Every time you do something that the private banks and the private central banks, as well as the Bank for International Settlements, which is where they all meet in Switzerland, if you do something that they don't like, then they will punish you economically. That's the way things are nowadays. And we need politicians right across the world, particularly in the United States and across the European countries, who are prepared to stand up to these private bankers who think they run things. In fact, what they're doing is, of course, they're buying up much of our media that we need to keep democracy going. They're also buying up many of our politicians, funding our political parties. People like Goldman Sachs dominate many of the political parties, particularly in the right across Europe. And that's one of the things that needs to be considered here. The only way we can really deal with this is if we decentralise and people in each individual country start to get back control of the money system, because it's not really austerity, it's a form of economic warfare that we've been putting up with for the past 6, 7, 8, 9 years.
Well, the problem that I'm looking at here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott Rickard, is there was much talk about how there was going to be a contagion effect when this Brexit took place. And of course, we're looking at other countries in Europe particularly. They've been in the works in terms of their push for independence for quite some time. We talk about Catalonia, we could talk about Spain, we talk about France, Germany itself also. I think there's about 20 regions in all. So are we looking at a real fundamental shakeup when it comes to Europe?
Well, certainly you are. I mean, you know, when unfortunately, the only thing I would disagree with what Mr. Gosling said is that there's been austerity in the United States. You know, that's a laughing matter. There has been no austerity in the United States. The banks were bailed out in full, and the people didn't suffer at all, other than, you know, basically the economy didn't move very well ahead after that. However, there was absolutely no reductions in any type of government funding or government pensions, unlike in places like Spain and like Greece and other countries throughout Europe that suffered severe cuts to their economic environments. Their pensions were cut in half in some of these countries, and they had to give up a lot of their industry in these countries. They've had to actually sell off assets in their countries in order to survive, and certainly the West does not have to suffer. The West takes 10 times the amount of bailout money that these countries take per capita and doesn't suffer any type of austerity. Now, that being said, obviously England has suffered some austerity. Certainly the Irish have suffered some austerity, but the United States not whatsoever has suffered any austerity, and that's not being fair. Now, is the European Union on the brink of failure because of the massive amounts of protests? You know, Greece was a great example. When Greece came in and Theresa took over and they were actually looking to pull out of the EU, they had to fire the finance minister, and then the IMF moved in and cut a bunch of deals with Syriza in order to actually make it happen in the Greek economic market. So you'll see the same thing. They'll come in and they'll try to patch the small holes that have occurred. But I think what's going to happen now is the holes will get much bigger and much more widespread, and there is not enough patch to cover it.
Well, one of the things that I'd like to get your reaction on, Tony Gosling, is Nicola Sturgeon's feelings towards, and let me quote her. She said, and let me be crystal clear about this. This is one of her, I guess, one of her pressers. Let me be crystal clear about this. We cannot trust the likes of Boris Johnson and Liam Fox to do that for us. So what does she have against Boris Johnson in particular and Liam Fox? And this was right when she said the UK is on a path of an isolationist course.
Well, I mean, she is talking nonsense. It's not isolationism. The idea is that we can see outside our borders an economic tsunami heading towards us. So it makes absolute sense to shore up your borders, whether that's to do with allowing absolutely anybody who's an EU citizen in and out of the country, or whether it's an economic kind of barrier you want to put up. We do need to make sure that when this tsunami hits, as it will do, financial crisis 2, HSBC are calling it, and it could happen any time, that we do actually protect our own people. So I don't really agree with her at all on that. We've got also, of course, the fiasco. I mean, this is why people are so fed up with the EU. Scots as well, by the way, as I pointed out, 10% more Scots want to stay in the United Kingdom than to stay in the European Union. And it doesn't seem as if this is registered with Nicola Sturgeon at all. The CETA fiasco this week, the Canadian Prime Minister is flying over to Europe to sign a deal that he can't sign because other people, particularly in Belgium and elsewhere, simply haven't signed it. So it's almost like they're living in cloud cuckoo land. They think that they can have these wonderful trade deals with the EU and everything's going to be wonderful. In fact, that particular deal is particularly appalling because it allows big corporations to sue governments who are doing things the people want. So the EU simply hasn't been working, and there are still some people like Nicola Sturgeon around who haven't recognised that.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you. Political analyst and former American intelligence linguist Scott Rickard spoke to us from Tampa, and Tony Gosling was just speaking. He's an investigative journalist from London. Thanks so much. Bristol. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitahwe, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.